Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. In the previous lecture, we talked about the first of the major progressive presidents in the White House, Teddy Roosevelt, and some of his early actions. In this lecture, we'll continue our discussion of Roosevelt and talk about two of his major roles, one as the so-called trust buster and the other as a key figure in the growing environmentalist movement. Teddy Roosevelt is something of an anomaly. Raised in a wealthy family himself, he became known as a champion of the common man and defended average citizens against corporate interest and big business in a number of ways. He's sometimes known as the trust buster for his efforts to break up large companies that in many ways were hindering the rights and abilities of average citizens and consumers to fully reach their potential. While his successors, Taft and Wilson, actually did more to break up the monopolies of the day than Teddy Roosevelt did, he did voice concerns about the monopolies and made significant efforts to curtail them, with some limitations. Roosevelt was concerned about the excessive power of some of these big businesses for several reasons. For one, he worried about the growing tensions and even violence between workers and companies in that era. The continued consolidation of power in the hands of just a few companies might lead to even further disruptions, perhaps destroying the entire American system. He also worried that some companies were becoming so big and powerful that they were beyond the control of even the federal government. He wanted to make sure to rein them in before it was too late. But Roosevelt did not engage the process of striking down monopolies as vigorously as some of his successors. For Roosevelt, while he was concerned about the growing size and power of some businesses, also recognized that such businesses also had the potential to contribute many positives in society. The largest companies could invest in researching and developing new technologies that small companies simply couldn't do. And large companies, due to economies of scale, could actually charge lower prices than their smaller competitors. Of course, this also contributed to their frightening power and control of certain industries. So for Roosevelt, it wasn't so simple a question of just eliminating all monopolies. He attempted to distinguish between good monopolies and bad monopolies, in the process leaving largely unchecked some of the most dominant businesses of the era. But those monopolies that he determined to be bad monopolies in his own view, he did pursue with considerable vigor. The president's weapon in this endeavor was the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed by Congress in 1890. The law declared illegal all combinations in the restraint of trade. It had not really been used much by the federal government over the first decade or so of its existence, and the courts typically sided with big business when these kind of questions arose, and we've talked about a number of examples already. Roosevelt understood that it wasn't so much an issue of passing new laws, but simply enforcing the laws as they existed at that time, and once he thought the courts would support him, he pursued those bad trusts, as he called them. Most significantly, he attacked J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Company, which controlled most of the railroad shipping across the United States. In 1902, Roosevelt's Attorney General filed a suit against the Northern Securities Company, and eventually the process made its way to the Supreme Court, which agreed that the company needed to be dissolved in a 5-4 ruling. The victory demonstrated that under Roosevelt, no man was above the law, and no company was above reproach. His assault on big business made him a champion of the common man, and he was enormously popular throughout the country. Roosevelt is also well known for his interest in environmentalism and his growing role in the environmental questions of the era. During the Progressive Era, environmental concerns began to take a prominent place in the national conversation for the first time. Up to the late 19th century, Americans had more or less ravaged the environment to promote industry and wealth, with little mind to the environmental damage being done. Like other forms of activism discussed in the course, a growing number of Americans began to voice concerns about the damage being done to the environment. As it remains so today, environmentalism was a complex issue involving a wide range of motivations and views. Perhaps the most visible strain of environmentalists were strict preservationists, the most prominent of whom was John Muir, one of the founders of the Sierra Club in 1892. Muir was a passionate defender of the wilderness and the environment, spending much time living in the wilderness. He valued nature for nature's sake, and the wonder of the world's trees, forests, rivers, and streams should be preserved for their own sake, Muir and many others argued. Others were less dedicated to the strict preservation of the environment, though they also embraced nature and the wilderness in various ways. President Roosevelt fell into this middle group, who might be described as conservationists. Roosevelt was an avid hunter and outdoorsman, who often hiked, hunted, and camped throughout his life. Indeed, it was a lengthy voyage down the Brazilian river called the Rio da Duvida, River of Doubt, in 1913 and 14 that contributed to Roosevelt's death. Roosevelt and his party were afflicted with all manner of problems during the voyage, including malaria and other diseases. Roosevelt suffered a wound on his leg that became infected, and he spent the latter portion of the journey near death. While he survived the trip, he died less than 5 years later at the relatively young age of 60, in part because his body never fully recovered from the trip. While he did love nature and the outdoors, Roosevelt supported the idea of conservation, of wisely using natural resources to also support business and human development. He supported setting aside portions of the American wilderness as national parks, not to be touched, but he didn't endorse the strict preservationist view that all nature must be preserved. As one example, Roosevelt supported the Newlands Reclamation Act of 1902, which encouraged developers and settlers to move to undeveloped land and to develop that land through irrigation. The government utilized funds from selling those lands to then develop and irrigate other lands, thus bringing life to hundreds of thousands of acres of barren land. Roosevelt developed a friendship and mutual respect for John Muir. In 1903, they took a camping trip together to Yosemite National Park, where Muir encouraged Roosevelt to broaden his protection of America's wilderness. Utilizing his presidential powers, Roosevelt eventually set aside more than 150 million acres of federal land as national forest, protected from loggers and developers. Many in the country were far less concerned about the environment than Muir or even Roosevelt. There were those who supported the continued development of federal lands, unchecked by any limits. In fact, many in Congress opposed Roosevelt's protection of the wilderness, and in 1907, Congress passed a law preventing the president from setting aside additional territory in 6 western states. Before the law went into effect, Roosevelt set aside more than 16 million additional acres for protection in those states. The conflict between conservationists and protectionists reached its fullest measure in the debate over the Hetch Hetchy Valley near San Francisco. San Francisco suffered from a shortage of fresh water, and for years city advocates argued for the construction of a dam, which would create a reservoir in Hetch Hetchy that would supply the city with fresh water. Preservationists, of course, despised the idea of a dam that would result in the flooding of thousands of acres of land and the destruction of untold wildlife and forests. The debate raged for years across the presidencies of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, and a variety of congressional acts. Muir and others fought passionately for the preservation of the region. Eventually, though, city planners prevailed, and in 1913, Wilson signed the act proposing a dam at Hetch Hetchy. While Muir and the environmentalists were despondent at their defeat, they also conceded that the debate had brought newfound attention to the environment that would lead to far more protection of nature than we had ever seen before. It's noteworthy that such a debate took place at all, since only a few decades earlier, the destruction of the environment had carried on completely unchecked. By 1900, though, environmentalists had enough clout to delay an action like the Hetch Hetchy Dam for more than a decade. Indeed, conservation swept across the country in the early decades of the 20th century. By 1916, there were 16 national parks with more than 300,000 visitors each year. The Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts formed with the intent of educating urban youth about nature and encouraging them to embrace and support environmentalism. A host of conservation and wildlife societies were formed in this era, with millions of Americans joining them. So while Teddy Roosevelt was not fully in the preservation camp, he did more to protect America's wilderness than any president since Thomas Jefferson. The full-blown environmental catastrophe of earlier years was averted, and the national consciousness towards environmental protection was stirred. This attention to the environment continues to be a national issue of grave importance even today. In the next lecture, we'll talk about the presidents following Roosevelt in the White House, Taft and Wilson.